Go ahead, Emily. Save us. Jason Miller's voice carried across the glass-walled conference room with the smooth confidence of a man certain he had just made someone else the punchline. A few people laughed. Others lowered their eyes toward their laptops, pretending not to notice the quiet young woman standing beside the 70-inch presentation screen. Emily Carter said nothing. At 29, she had already learned that people often revealed more about themselves when you gave them silence instead of resistance. She wore a plain cream cardigan over a light blue blouse, her brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail, and nothing about her suggested that she belonged at the center of attention. That was exactly why Jason had chosen her. He leaned back in his chair and pointed toward the financial forecast glowing behind her. Emily likes numbers, he added, drawing another restrained chuckle from the team. Maybe our spreadsheet girl can tell us why the model suddenly thinks our biggest client is about to lose $12 million. Vanessa Brooks, the project lead, remained seated near the head of the polished walnut table. She did not laugh, but she did not stop him either. Around her sat 9 analysts from Hawthorne Analytics, one of Chicago's fastest-growing financial consulting firms, and almost every person in that room had heard Jason make jokes about Emily before. She was the junior analyst at the last desk near the windows, the woman who arrived before most of them and left after the cleaning crew began emptying trash cans. She fixed broken formulas without announcing it. She corrected mislabeled data without asking for credit. When meetings became competitions over who could speak the loudest, Emily usually listened. To Jason, silence meant weakness. To everyone else, it made her easy to overlook. But that morning, as sunlight reflected from the towers beyond the conference room windows, something was different. Emily stared at the forecast on the screen, then at the spreadsheet open on the laptop before her. Her expression did not collapse the way Jason expected. Instead, her eyes narrowed slightly. She moved closer. One column, then another. Her gaze stopped on a weighting coefficient buried deep inside the model. Jason checked his watch. Any time now. Another laugh traveled around the table. Emily slowly placed one hand beside the keyboard. This number, she said quietly. Jason smiled. What about it? Emily looked directly at him. Her voice remained calm. It shouldn't be here. The laughter disappeared. Vanessa leaned forward. Jason's smile held for another second before tightening at the corners. He had expected embarrassment, perhaps an apology, maybe even a nervous retreat to her chair. What he had not expected was certainty. Emily turned back toward the screen, unaware that this small moment would soon expose a mistake far larger than anyone in that room understood. Jason believed he was humiliating the quietest person on his team. He had no idea that before the week was over, Emily Carter would become the one person everyone at Hawthorne Analytics needed. Emily did not explain what she had noticed. Not yet. She studied the number for another moment, then quietly stepped away from the laptop. I would need to review the source data before I could say exactly what caused it, she said. Jason gave a satisfied little smile, as though her caution were an admission of defeat. There we go, he said, turning toward the others. Mystery solved. Maybe we should leave predictive modeling to people who actually do it for a living. A few uncomfortable laughs followed, but Vanessa did not join them this time. Her attention remained on Emily. There had been something unusual in the younger woman's voice, not uncertainty, but restraint. Emily returned to her seat near the windows and opened her notebook. She had occupied that desk for 11 months, long enough for everyone at Hawthorne Analytics to decide who she was without ever bothering to ask. She arrived every morning at 7:15, usually carrying coffee from the small shop across the street and a canvas bag that had seen better days. Her clothes were neat but simple. She drove an 8-year-old sedan. She rarely attended happy hour, never competed for attention during meetings, and seemed perfectly content to spend hours checking numbers that everyone else considered tedious. To Jason, ambition was something people announced. Emily had never announced anything. What he did not notice were the corrections that appeared before client reports went out, the formulas quietly repaired after someone copied the wrong cell, or the strange inconsistencies Emily found before they became expensive problems. 3 months earlier, analyst Kevin Parker had accidentally reversed two variables in a quarterly projection. Emily caught it at 6:45 one evening and fixed it before the report reached the client. Kevin thanked her privately. The next morning, Jason praised Kevin for producing clean work. Emily said nothing. A month later, Vanessa struggled with a forecasting table that kept producing contradictory results. Emily suggested changing the sampling window. The problem disappeared. During the presentation, Vanessa described the solution as a team adjustment. Again, Emily said nothing. That silence slowly became permission. Jason started calling her Spreadsheet Girl. At first, it sounded almost playful. Then he began using it whenever Emily raised a technical concern. Do not worry, Spreadsheet Girl will clean it up. Or, give Emily the boring part. She loves that stuff. Each joke seemed small enough to ignore, and that was precisely how disrespect settled into the office, not through one enormous moment, but through dozens of little ones that everyone learned to accept. Yet there were clues no one understood. Emily kept an old black notebook beside her keyboard, filled not with meeting notes, but with equations, probability trees, and handwritten models far beyond the work assigned to a junior analyst. Sometimes, during lunch, she opened research papers instead of social media. And whenever the team discussed complex forecasting problems, her eyes changed. She became intensely still, as if she were hearing a language everyone else only partly understood. That afternoon, after the conference room emptied, Emily returned to the model Jason had mocked her for questioning. She traced the data backward through 6 months of historical inputs until she found the same weighting coefficient again. Then, again. Her expression tightened. The number was not a random mistake. It was part of the model's foundation. Emily opened her black notebook and wrote one sentence beneath the date. If this assumption is wrong, the entire forecast is wrong. She closed the notebook just as Jason walked past her desk. Still chasing ghosts? He asked. Emily looked up at him, calm and unreadable. Just checking the numbers. Jason laughed and continued toward his office. He never noticed that Vanessa, standing 20 feet away, had heard every word. By Wednesday morning, the jokes had become part of the office routine. Jason entered Hawthorne Analytics carrying a large coffee and dropped a stack of printed reports beside Emily's keyboard. Special delivery for Spreadsheet Girl, he said. Try not to discover another imaginary crisis before lunch. Kevin Parker looked up from the next row of desks, then quickly returned to his monitor. Two analysts near the break room exchanged smiles. Emily simply moved the reports beside her black notebook. I will review them, she said. Her calmness seemed to irritate Jason more than an argument would have. He wanted embarrassment. He wanted her to defend herself so he could dismiss her as overly sensitive. Instead, Emily gave him nothing to push against. What Jason did not understand was that she had spent most of the previous evening reviewing the forecasting model from her apartment. She had traced the questionable assumption through thousands of historical records and found the same distortion appearing repeatedly. Each time market volatility increased, the model underestimated the client's exposure. It was subtle enough to disappear during ordinary conditions, but under pressure, the error widened dramatically. Emily had documented everything. She had also learned something else during her 11 months at Hawthorne. Being correct was not always enough. People had to be willing to listen. At 10:30, Vanessa called the team into the main conference room to prepare for Friday's client presentation. The room filled quickly. Jason stood near the screen, confident again, explaining the forecast as if Tuesday's problem had never happened. Our model remains extremely reliable, he said. Emily watched the charts change behind him. Then a slide appeared showing the 6-month risk projection. Her eyes stopped on the same pattern. Vanessa, she said quietly, could we revisit the weighting assumption before Friday? Jason exhaled loudly. Again? Emily kept her attention on Vanessa. I ran a historical comparison. The model appears to underestimate exposure when volatility rises above the range used during calibration. The room became still for a moment. Vanessa glanced toward Jason. Did you check that? Jason smiled as though the question itself were unnecessary. Of course. We tested the model extensively. Then he looked at Emily. But since our junior analyst has apparently discovered something the rest of the department missed, perhaps she would like to explain it. A few people shifted in their chairs. Emily opened her notebook. I can show the comparison. No, Jason said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the screen. Do not just tell us. Come up here. Teach us. His tone transformed the invitation into a challenge. Emily rose and walked toward the front. Jason handed her the presentation remote with exaggerated politeness. This should be educational. Emily ignored the remark. She pulled up the historical data and began explaining how the model behaved during periods of increased uncertainty. Her first 2 sentences were clear and measured. Then Jason interrupted. That is not how the calibration works. Emily paused. I understand the calibration. I am saying the underlying assumption changes the result when conditions move outside the original range. Emily, Jason said with a patient smile, these models are more complicated than checking formulas in a spreadsheet. A restrained laugh came from the far end of the table. Emily's fingers tightened around the remote. She tried once more. If we compare March with the current inputs, you can see the divergence beginning here. This is why experience matters, Jason said, turning toward the team before she could finish. You can find patterns everywhere if you stare at numbers long enough. This time the laughter was louder. Emily stood beneath the bright conference room lights as heat rose into her cheeks. Vanessa looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. Emily slowly returned the remote to the table. Before sitting down, she opened her notebook and circled one figure in red ink, 0.0847. Nobody asked what it meant. Nobody noticed when she closed the notebook. Jason continued his presentation, satisfied that the interruption was over. But Emily no longer watched him. She stared at the number she had circled, because if her calculation was right, Friday's presentation was not the real problem. The real problem was already moving through the client's forecast, and every hour they ignored it made the consequences harder to contain. Thursday began with a silence that felt different. Emily arrived at 7:12, set her coffee beside the black notebook, and opened the forecasting files before most of the office lights had switched on. Outside the windows, Chicago was waking beneath a pale gray sky, traffic crawling along the streets 30 floors below. Inside Hawthorne Analytics, Emily compared the client's latest market data against the model one final time. The result made her sit perfectly still. The number she had circled in red was no longer just a warning. It was evidence. At 8:43, Vanessa hurried across the office with her phone pressed to her ear, her expression tight. Conference room. Everyone. Now. Within minutes, the team gathered around the walnut table. Jason entered last, still adjusting his tie. What happened? Vanessa placed her phone down. The client ran an independent stress test overnight. Their projected exposure is off by nearly $12 million. Nobody moved. Kevin stared at the screen. One analyst whispered, "That cannot be right." Jason stepped forward. Their test must be using different assumptions. Vanessa shook her head. They used ours. The room went silent. Emily opened her notebook. There it was, 0.0847. The same figure everyone had ignored less than 24 hours earlier. Vanessa looked directly at her. Emily. Jason turned sharply. What? Vanessa pointed toward the notebook. Yesterday she said the weighting assumption was distorting the forecast. Jason's confidence flickered. She suggested there might be an issue. That is not the same thing. Vanessa ignored him. Emily, did you know this could happen? Every face turned toward the quiet woman at the far side of the table. Emily chose her words carefully. I suspected the model was underestimating exposure when volatility moved outside the original calibration range. Can you prove it? Vanessa asked. Emily looked at the screen, then at the files she had spent hours reviewing. Yes. One word changed the temperature of the room. Jason folded his arms. Then prove it. Emily connected her laptop to the display and opened a comparison she had prepared before sunrise. She showed the original model beside 6 months of historical data, then isolated the weighting coefficient. The model performs normally under stable conditions, she explained, but when volatility increases, this assumption suppresses part of the risk signal. The higher the uncertainty becomes, the more the forecast drifts away from the actual exposure. Kevin leaned closer. How far? Emily entered the client's newest figures. The calculation refreshed. A red variance appeared. $11,870,000. No one laughed. Vanessa slowly sat down. Jason stared at the screen as if waiting for the number to disappear. That could still be coincidence, he said. Emily changed the date range. The same pattern appeared. She changed it again. Again, the pattern remained. It is not coincidence, she said softly. Jason's jaw tightened. Why did you not escalate this earlier? The question landed with such audacity that Kevin looked up immediately. Emily's eyes stayed steady. I did. Silence returned, heavier now. Vanessa glanced from Emily to Jason, remembering the laughter, the interruptions, the dismissive smile. For the first time, Jason seemed aware that everyone else remembered too. He straightened his jacket. Fine. We found a flaw. We fix it before tomorrow. Vanessa looked at the clock. The client wants a corrected model by 9 tomorrow morning. Kevin exhaled. That gives us less than 24 hours. Jason turned toward the screen, suddenly all business. Then we rebuild. Emily closed her notebook halfway. It is not that simple. Jason looked at her. Why not? Emily hesitated only a second. Because the weighting error is not the whole problem. Vanessa's face changed. What else did you find? Emily reopened the notebook and turned to 3 pages filled with equations no one in that room had seen before. The correction changes the assumptions underneath the entire forecast. Jason stopped mid-word. Emily looked around the table. If we repair this properly, we are not fixing one number. We are rebuilding the model. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The 3 pages inside Emily's notebook looked nothing like the routine spreadsheets Jason had spent months assigning her. Equations crossed the paper in careful lines, connected by arrows, probability ranges, and handwritten notes comparing different market conditions. Vanessa leaned closer. When did you do all of this? Emily glanced at the clock. Some of it last night. The rest this morning. Kevin stared at her. You rebuilt the assumptions overnight? Not the model, Emily said. Only the framework we would need to rebuild it correctly. Jason stepped toward the table, his expression tightening as attention shifted away from him. Hold on. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Emily identified a bad coefficient. That does not mean she suddenly understands the entire architecture. Emily closed the notebook gently. I never said that. Good, Jason replied. Because this model took our senior team 4 months to develop. Vanessa looked at him. And right now it is wrong by almost $12 million. The words landed hard. Jason's face changed. For the first time that morning, he had no quick answer. Vanessa turned back to Emily. How long would it take to rebuild? Emily considered the question. If we work from the original data and remove the unstable assumptions, maybe 12 hours. But we would need to validate every stage before sending anything to the client. Kevin let out a slow breath. 12 hours. Emily nodded. If everyone helps. Jason gave a short laugh. That is optimistic. It is possible, Emily said. Her voice was quiet, but the uncertainty that had once made people dismiss her was gone. Jason looked around the room and noticed something he disliked even more than being contradicted. People were listening to her. Fine, he said. We will use my original structure and adjust the weighting. Emily shook her head. That will not solve it. You do not know that. I tested it. Jason's eyes narrowed. On what authority? The question made Kevin shift uncomfortably. Vanessa folded her arms. Emily could have answered with anger. She could have reminded Jason that he had laughed when she warned him, or that his authority had just produced a multi-million-dollar forecasting failure. Instead, she opened her laptop. On the data, she displayed 3 simulations. In the first, Jason's proposed adjustment reduced the error, but left more than $6 million in hidden exposure. The second failed under a different volatility range. The third produced a similar distortion after only 4 cycles. The room became completely quiet. Jason stared at the results. "Where did you learn to model like this?" Kevin asked. Emily hesitated. It was the first personal question anyone in that office had asked her in months. "A long time ago," she said. Jason recovered quickly. "This is still preliminary. Anyone can run simulations until they find the result they want." Emily's expression barely changed, but Vanessa's did. "Jason, enough." He looked at her. "I am protecting the project." "No," Vanessa said. "Right now, you're protecting your pride." Silence settled across the table. Jason's face reddened. Emily lowered her eyes toward her notebook, not from fear, but because she had no interest in watching him be embarrassed. That small gesture should have ended the confrontation. Instead, Jason made the choice that would change everything. "If Emily is so certain," he said, "then let her rebuild it." Vanessa studied him carefully. "You are serious?" "Absolutely." She found the problem. She can own the solution. His tone sounded cooperative, but Emily heard what was underneath it. If she succeeded, Jason could call it teamwork. If she failed, the failure would belong to her. Vanessa looked at Emily. "Can you do it?" Emily glanced at the clock again. The client deadline was less than 24 hours away. Then she looked at the people around the table, including the ones who had laughed at her only yesterday. "Yes," she said. "But we do it properly." By 6:30 that evening, the Chicago skyline had turned from silver to deep blue, and most of the offices surrounding Hawthorne Analytics were dark. Inside the main conference room, however, every screen was still glowing. Coffee cups crowded the walnut table. Takeout containers sat unopened beside stacks of printed data. Emily stood near the display, guiding Kevin and 2 other analysts through the new framework while Vanessa coordinated validation checks from her laptop. Jason remained near the far end of the table, watching with growing discomfort as the team began directing questions toward Emily instead of him. "Run the stress test again with the 5-year range," Emily said. Kevin entered the figures. The model processed for several seconds. Variance is down to 1.8%. Vanessa looked up. "That is the lowest we have seen all day." Emily nodded. "Now increase volatility by 30%. Jason frowned. "That is excessive." Emily turned toward him. "The client does not need a model that works only when conditions are comfortable." Kevin ran the test. The numbers shifted, but the forecast remained stable. A quiet murmur moved around the room. Jason stepped closer. "You are changing too many assumptions at once. We should preserve more of the original structure." Emily studied him for a moment. "The original structure is what created the blind spot." His expression hardened. "You keep saying that like the model was entirely wrong. It was not entirely wrong." Emily's voice stayed even. "That is what made the problem difficult to see." Vanessa glanced between them. "Can we focus on getting this finished?" Jason nodded, but the frustration in his face remained. For another hour, Emily worked without raising her voice or claiming authority. She simply answered every question. When Kevin misunderstood a probability adjustment, she explained it again without making him feel foolish. When another analyst discovered a data conflict, Emily thanked her for catching it. Slowly, something changed around the table. The people who had once watched Emily from a distance began moving their chairs closer. At 8:15, Kevin finally asked the question everyone had been thinking. "Emily, where did you learn this?" Her hands stopped above the keyboard. The room quieted. "Northwestern," she said. Jason looked up sharply. Emily continued. "I was in a doctoral program in applied statistics. My research focused on predictive risk models under unstable market conditions." Kevin stared at her. "You were working on this exact kind of problem?" "Something close to it." Vanessa leaned back. "Why did you leave?" Emily looked toward the dark windows. "My mother became ill during my 3rd year. She lived in Wisconsin and needed someone nearby. I thought I would take 1 semester away." Her voice softened. 1 semester became 2 years. Nobody interrupted. "After she passed away, I did not go back. I needed work, and I needed something that felt smaller for a while. Hawthorne had an opening." Jason's face had gone still. For months, he had treated her junior title as proof of limited ability. He had never considered that a resume could show where someone was standing without explaining how far they had already traveled. At 9:20, the rebuilt model passed another stress test. Kevin smiled for the first time all evening. That is 5 in a row. Emily allowed herself a small smile. Then Jason's laptop chimed. He read an incoming message and immediately straightened. The client moved the review meeting. Vanessa looked at him. To when? Jason swallowed. 7:30 tomorrow morning. The room fell silent. They had lost 90 minutes. Vanessa rubbed her forehead. Can we finish? Everyone looked at Emily. She studied the remaining validation files, then closed her black notebook. Yes, she said. But nobody goes home yet. This time, no one laughed. At 11:47 that night, the office no longer felt like the place where Emily had spent 11 months being overlooked. The jokes were gone. So were the casual interruptions. When she spoke, people listened. Kevin worked beside her, checking every output against the historical records, while Vanessa reviewed the client documentation line by line. Two analysts who had once laughed at Jason's comments were now testing the rebuilt model across different market conditions, calling out results as they appeared. 7-year range is stable, one said. Extreme volatility test is stable, another added. Emily nodded without looking away from her screen. Run the recession scenario next. Jason sat several feet away, unusually quiet. He had tried twice to redirect the team toward his original framework, but each comparison had led them back to the same conclusion. Emily's approach was stronger. That fact alone was difficult for him to accept. What made it worse was how naturally the others had begun trusting her. Shortly after midnight, Vanessa received another message from the client. Her eyes moved quickly across the screen. They want a full explanation of the original failure during the meeting. Jason straightened. I will handle that. Vanessa looked at him carefully. Emily should explain the technical issue. I am the senior analyst. And she found it. The room went quiet. Jason glanced toward Emily. Finding one flaw does not make her responsible for the entire analysis. Emily closed a data window and turned toward him. I do not need credit, Jason. I need the client to understand what happened so they can trust the correction. His expression tightened. That sounds convenient. Kevin looked up. What does that mean? Jason hesitated, then made the mistake pride had been pushing him toward all evening. We should at least consider how the error appeared. Emily has been inside these files for months. She was the one doing routine checks. Vanessa stared at him. Are you suggesting she caused it? I am saying we should not make assumptions. The room became completely still. Emily did not react immediately. She opened a folder on her laptop. You are right, she said. Jason seemed surprised. Emily continued. We should not make assumptions. She displayed the version history. Every major change to the forecasting model was recorded by date, time, and user account. Emily scrolled back 4 months and stopped. The weighting coefficient had been entered during the original model build, weeks before Emily had been given access to the project. Beside the change was the name of the senior analyst who approved it. Jason Miller. Kevin slowly leaned back. Vanessa's eyes remained on the screen. Jason's face lost color. That does not prove I created the assumption. No, Emily said calmly. It proves I did not. She could have gone further. She could have embarrassed him the way he had embarrassed her. Instead, she closed the version history. We have 7 hours until the meeting. I would rather finish the model. No one spoke for several seconds. That restraint affected the room more deeply than any angry response could have. At 2:15 in the morning, the final validation began. At 3:12, the rebuilt model passed every test. Kevin whispered, we did it. But Emily was already studying the client presentation. Not yet, she said. We still have to make them believe it. By 6:50, morning light was spreading across Chicago. The team entered the executive conference room carrying laptops, coffee, and the exhaustion of a night without sleep. On the screen, the client's executives appeared one by one. Jason took his usual place at the front. Emily sat quietly near the end of the table. Then the client's chief financial officer asked the first question. Who can explain why your original model failed? Jason opened his mouth, but Vanessa looked past him. Emily, she said. Take this one. Emily rose from her chair and walked toward the screen with the same black notebook she had carried every day for 11 months. Across the video call, the client's chief financial officer, Richard Coleman, waited with 3 other executives. No one inside Hawthorne's conference room moved. The original model failed because one of its assumptions remained fixed while market conditions changed, Emily began. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. Under ordinary conditions, that assumption produced results close enough to appear reliable. When volatility increased, however, the model began suppressing part of the risk signal. Richard leaned forward. How did your team miss that? Jason shifted in his chair. Emily could have looked at him. She did not. Because the error was small at first, she said. And because the model performed well under the conditions it was originally tested against. The weakness became visible only when we compared its behavior across a wider range of historical conditions. She changed the screen to a simple chart. The original forecast appeared beside the corrected model. This line represents the old projection. This one represents the rebuilt version. One of the client executives asked, "And you are confident the new model will hold under another major shift?" We tested that question directly, Emily replied. She showed the results from the overnight simulations, including recession conditions and sharp increases in volatility. Richard studied the numbers. What is the current variance? 1.8% under the most demanding scenario we tested. Vanessa looked toward Kevin. He gave a small nod. Richard remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked the question Jason had clearly been waiting for. Who built the replacement model? Jason straightened and began. Our team worked through the night to restructure the framework, and as senior analyst, I coordinated. Emily, Richard interrupted, I am asking you. Every face turned toward her. Jason froze mid-sentence. Emily looked around the conference room. She saw Kevin, who had checked hundreds of records beside her. She saw Vanessa, who had stayed through the night reviewing every validation report. She saw the analysts who had once laughed at Jason's jokes, but had spent the last several hours testing every assumption she gave them. And she saw Jason, suddenly silent. Emily could have claimed the moment entirely for herself. No one would have questioned it. Instead, she said, we built it. Richard raised an eyebrow. I designed the revised framework, but Kevin validated the historical comparisons, Vanessa coordinated the risk review, and the rest of the team tested the model across every scenario we could reasonably anticipate. It works because everyone challenged it. Kevin lowered his eyes, visibly moved. Vanessa's expression softened. Even Jason looked surprised. Richard sat back. That is not the answer I expected. Emily gave a small smile. A model should not depend on one person being right. It should survive everyone trying to prove it wrong. The silence that followed was different from every silence Emily had experienced in that office. No one was waiting for her to stumble. No one was preparing a joke. They were listening. Richard glanced at the other executives on the call, then returned his attention to Emily. We want to move forward with the revised model. Vanessa released a breath she had been holding for what felt like an hour. Kevin smiled. There is one condition, Richard continued. The room tightened again. We want Emily involved in every quarterly risk review going forward. Jason looked down at the table. Emily remained still. Richard added, and I would like her to present the methodology to our board next month. Vanessa smiled openly now. That can be arranged. The call ended several minutes later. For a moment, nobody in the room spoke. Then Kevin looked at Emily and said quietly, you saved this account. Emily shook her head. We saved it. Across the table, Jason stared at the darkened screen, finally understanding that the woman he had spent months trying to make smaller had just been given every opportunity to make him look small in return, and she had chosen not to. The office remained quiet after the call ended, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Morning sunlight had filled the conference room, revealing empty coffee cups, tired faces, and the scattered notes from a night that had changed more than a financial model. Jason finally pushed his chair back. He looked at Emily, then at Vanessa, then at the rest of the team. For once, there was no practiced smile on his face. "I need to say something," he began. Kevin stopped gathering his papers. Jason rested both hands on the table. "Emily warned us before the client found the problem. She warned me more than once, and I dismissed her." His voice tightened slightly. "I also made comments that were disrespectful, and when the situation became serious, I tried to protect myself instead of listening to her." No one interrupted. Emily watched him steadily. Jason took a breath. "The model failed because I was too confident in something I had helped approve. The account survived because Emily saw what I did not." He turned toward her. "I am sorry." Emily could have made him wait. Instead, she gave a small nod. "Thank you for saying that." Jason seemed almost surprised by the simplicity of her answer. Vanessa closed her laptop. "There will still be a formal review of what happened," she said. "Not because one person made one mistake, but because our team created an environment where a valid concern could be laughed out of the room. That cannot happen again." The words settled over everyone. The problem had never been only a coefficient buried inside a forecasting model. It had also been the habit of deciding whose voice mattered before hearing what that person had to say. Over the following weeks, Hawthorne Analytics changed in ways Emily never requested. People stopped leaving routine cleanup work on her desk. Kevin began asking her opinion before finalizing complex projections. Analysts who once walked past her without speaking started pulling up chairs beside her, notebooks open, asking how she approached risk assumptions. Jason became quieter. He still had confidence, but it no longer filled every room before anyone else could speak. When he disagreed with Emily, he asked questions instead of making jokes. 3 weeks after the client meeting, Vanessa called Emily into her office. A folder rested on the desk. "The executive committee approved a new modeling group," Vanessa said. "They want you to lead it." Emily looked at the folder without touching it. "Lead it?" "Senior Quantitative Modeling Manager." Vanessa smiled. "And before you ask, yes, the salary matches the responsibility." Emily let out a quiet laugh. "I was not going to ask that first." "I know. That is probably one reason they chose you." Emily accepted the position. Yet very little about her changed. She still arrived early. She still carried the same canvas bag. The black notebook remained beside her keyboard, its worn cover now filled with several more pages of equations. A month later, the team gathered for another Monday morning meeting. Emily sat in her familiar seat near the windows while Jason presented a new forecasting proposal. Halfway through, he stopped beside a complicated chart. Months earlier, he would have explained his conclusion and moved on. This time, he looked across the table. "Emily, what do you think?" She glanced at the numbers. Around her, laptops stopped clicking. Chairs became still. Every face turned toward her, not with amusement, not with impatience, but with attention. Emily opened her notebook and began to speak. No one interrupted. No one laughed. The room went silent, but this time, it was because everyone wanted to hear her.